I'm Robert Schertzer, Clinical Associate Professor at the University of British Columbia Department of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences and Director of the West Coast Glaucoma Centre in Vancouver, BC, and we're talking about glaucoma with my guest, Dale Heuer. In this episode, number 14, for late February 2011, we discuss the new devices being used for glaucoma surgery and the evidence for their benefit. Please check the show notes of this podcast for definitions and references related to today's topic. The show notes also include contact information to find me on Twitter, where I'm Rob Schertzer, my glaucoma, EMR, and tech blog, wholelotofrob.com, and my office website, westcoastglaucoma.com. It also includes the contact information for Dr. Heuer.
Well, welcome, Dale. Welcome to the Bat Cave here.
Rob, it's great to be here.
Great. I'd like to talk today about the newer surgical procedures for glaucoma. I mean, there are so many different options out there now. Different people see them at different meetings, or they have reps come around and they get interested in doing them. They see some literature that's thrust in front of them showing, hey, use this stent, use this new technique. You'll have fewer complications than those ugly trabeculectomies that some people still do. So I thought we could talk about some of these newer techniques and what the evidence is of any of them being effective, and maybe even touch on who pays for this stuff, because there's extra costs involved in these devices, and if they're no better than a trabeculectomy, then why should we be paying for them, and who pays that?
Well, it's certainly topical, Rob, and I appreciate the opportunity to try and discuss this issue. I think that trabeculectomy is clearly the operation we all love to hate, and many years ago when I started, it was hard to often get them to work, and now with the use of anti-fibrotic agents and better understanding of wound healing, we often get them to work, but then you have to be careful what you wish for. So now we have the problems of bleb infections and dysesthesia and bleb leaks and endophthalmitis.
And we end up with pressure that's too low, and we get to tell the patient, the procedure worked, but it worked too well. Isn't that great? It's
like the classic old saw, the operation was a success, but the patient died. But I think that we are seeing a renaissance of interest in glaucoma surgery, even from the entrepreneurial sector, and venture capitalists in the States have taken an interest. But I think one of the issues that we have to deal with is how do we get evidence-based information that allows us to make an informed decision for our patients in terms of the safety and efficacy of procedures.
Now, just to clarify, in the States, do you have to prove efficacy or just safety for devices, since you're involved in that?
You have to prove both. I understand that in Europe, and I'm not familiar with what the bar is in Canada, but in Europe, to get a CE approval, you just have to prove safety.
Right, and that's what it is here too, just prove safety.
So you have some devices that have not yet been approved down south in the lower 48, if you will. But I think that we have seen some new developments, and I think actually the interest has generated a lot of new understanding and new areas of exploration, particularly around Schlemm's canal and our understanding of outflow. But I think it started probably with a lot of the work that Stegman did on deep sclerectomy, viscocanalostomy, and I know there was a lot of interest, particularly in some parts of Europe, where that became the standard operation rather than trabeculectomy. Although in that realm, the randomized data, the limited randomized data that was available, suggested that trabeculectomy still gave more consistent pressures, and at least viscocanalostomy or deep sclerectomy, that those that did give lower pressures still had blebs. So that was perhaps not the ideal.
Right, and the original study with Stegman, I mean, they were good results, but they were in patients who weren't treated at all before.
Exactly.
That was their primary procedure.
Yeah, and so I think actually the next extension of that, the viscocanalostomy with the iStent canula, to go around the canal and do 360-degree viscocanalostomy, is
the iScience.
iScience, thank you.
iStent's another thing
we'll get to. That is perhaps the most elegant glaucoma procedure, and I personally love the canula for doing pediatric glaucoma, which I still do a fair amount of. But it is technically very challenging surgery. And the one area that I think has been exciting is to see that with the addition of suture tensioning, actually pressures in the lower teens do seem achievable. I think the challenge for that procedure remains the technical difficulty of doing it consistently for average surgeons. The fact that at least historically folks have tended to do it from a superior limbal location, so that if it doesn't work, you've now scarred up a lot of the conjunctiva. And the third thing is, since the excitement or the potential lowering seems to come from the suture tensioning, is there some way to standardize that in a way that will more consistently get us those lower pressures that at least our moderate and advanced glaucoma patients need? I think one of the sea changes we need to maybe think about a little bit is patients with earlier glaucoma, if we could get an operation that consistently and for the intermediate to longer term will achieve pressures of 16, 17, 18, those might be great for our patients with early disease and pressures in the 20s. But so many of the patients that I, as a glaucoma specialist, see have such bad damage, that's often not enough.
Right.
So.
Same here. I mean, I still do full-thickness procedures in pseudophakic patients on rare occasions.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other quasi-advances, at least some would characterize it, is a modification of the trabeculectomy with the express implant, which, as you know, was originally designed to just be a quickie, and hence the name Express.
Right. It was supposed to go right through the sclera and no trapdoor done at all.
And unfortunately, with that approach, so many patients ended up with hypotony and coronal detachment and erosion that was relatively quickly abandoned until Elie de Haan came up with the concept of putting it under a scleral flap, just like a trabeculectomy, instead of making the inner opening. And there's certainly a number of advocates who are superb glaucoma surgeons that have pretty much switched to that exclusively for their trabeculectomies. I tend to be a little bit of a data curmudgeon, and so far, with the exception of one study from, I think it was from Holland, and I'm sorry I'm blocking on the gentleman's name, but one study that did show that a year the group with the Express, in which he did a randomized study, had was less dependent on medicines, even though the two groups had similar outcome. The Express group needed less medicines. That's actually the first encouraging piece of what we might characterize as pure evidence-based science.
Yeah, it leads to a more predictable surgery because you don't have the variabilities of the internal sclerectomy, sometimes ending up at the ciliary body, sometimes getting a blood vessel.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I have been doing this, and I've done a few dozen of them, and I find the pressure is very predictable in those first 6 or 8 weeks, but the long-term result is probably identical. Yeah. So it's really a matter of, this starts getting into that cost analysis. What is the cost of the cost savings of a more predictable first 6 or 8 weeks after surgery? It certainly doesn't save our operating room a penny, and that's what they go by on the rationale whether to pay for the implants.
Well, certainly one of the rationales that my colleagues have used it a little more at our veterans hospital, where sometimes follow-up early on is a problem, because it does seem like the initial follow-up may be a little less rigorous, and as you point out, the pressure is more predictable. So many people have advocated it as the ideal approach for the occasional glaucoma surgeon who may not be quite as tuned into some of the nuances in terms of flap tightness and suture size or hole size and water tightness of the wound. Have you found that the tightness of your flap makes a great deal of difference in the outcome? Or?
Well, I find that basically you can't get a watertight flap. It takes up just enough room that it does make the flap stay a little bit open, and that's probably why we're getting that pressure.
Some have also
tends to be 8 to 10 right after surgery and stays there.
And some have made an observation that they seem to get more posterior blebs with at least one of the designs, and I don't personally use it, so I'm not familiar with the P and the R.
Right, that's the P50 versus the R. P for posterior.
And that's something we're always trying to achieve. So I think there's a possibility there, but I think Peter Netland's large study looking at a case control at a year, the visual outcome and the pressure outcome was the same. So it's back to your point, how much are we willing to pay for maybe a visit or two less to the doctor in the postoperative period if in the intermediate to long term we don't have a better visual outcome? It becomes a hard sell. I think we're all going to be pressed to get the data, and I think it does create a real problem because most of the companies developing these devices are small.
Right.
They tend to be capital starved, and if regulatory agencies or the healthcare funders in general start to say, unless you show us evidence compared to whatever the gold standard is, that you have a better outcome, I think we will actually really inhibit innovation, which I think is a bad thing. As much of a purist as I like to be, I think it is actually in many respects incumbent on the glaucoma community to generate those data.
Right.
Kind of because if the companies have to do it, first of all, there's always the potential perception that those companies have a vested interest in the outcome, and the results are always viewed a little bit with a jaded outcome. But I think the glaucoma community really probably needs to develop some kind of registry approach that can do fairly large intermediate term 3 to 5 year follow-up on large numbers of patients in a way that we can get the kind of data that we all need to move our patient care in the right direction. So I think there's a case in point with the Express implant that we need more data other than the one study from I think Holland.
Yeah, and we've also over the years we've actually changed how we do our basic trabeculectomy based on studies like the antimetabolite studies. Probably changed our technique in glaucoma surgery to make the trabeculectomy not so bad after all.
Yeah, we definitely had to get much better at wound closure and pay a lot more attention to that. And I think that being compelled to do that because of the wound healing modulation did improve the outcome, because we know that if a bleb leaks, it's less likely to work in the long term. Right. And if we didn't sew them well, they definitely leaked.
Yeah. So now we have a moving baseline to try to compare the newer techniques to if
Absolutely.
Our trabs are getting better.
Yeah.
What about some of the other?
Well, I think the other approaches that I think seem to have gathered some traction, particularly in the States and elsewhere, are related to again to the canal, but more of a goniotomy approach. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the trabectome, which was kind of an innovative concept, at least the teaching historically has been that goniotomy in adults doesn't tend to work because the tissue tends to collapse on itself and scar.
Yeah, so why not just remove it all?
So, and George Barvold and some colleagues, thought about just ablating it with cautery and taking out a strip with a cleverly designed footplate that protects the outer wall of Schlemm's canal. And at least the intermediate term results that I think Don Minkler and Brian Francis have been a couple of the drivers of looks relatively promising in terms of providing that kind of high to mid-teens outcome that I mentioned earlier, that particularly could shift our paradigm from, constantly marinating eyes with medications and maybe trying one medicine, if that doesn't work, going to one of these other approaches. Other things that are done in Europe in that regard, and I guess in Canada, is the new iStent, which is kind of like you can only think of it like a snorkle. Instead of cutting away Schlemm's canal, it's inserted into Schlemm's canal, bypassing what we've historically thought was the area of greatest resistance at the juxtacanalicular apparatus. And with two of those, Doug Johnson did some nice work in eye bank eyes and showed that you were able to get progressive pressure lowering with 1 or 2, minimal incremental at 3. And I think the approach generally being taken, and there's a paper, I think an investigative by a gentleman whose name I can't pronounce, that showed that it did have added value to cataract surgery. And that actually seems to be one of the areas where there's perhaps the most interest is kind of add-on therapy to cataract surgery in glaucoma patients. We certainly know that cataract surgery itself will tend to lower the pressure a little bit for a while, but studies randomized study of the iStent, or what I tend to call the snorkle, so I don't get confused with the iScience cannula, which I already got confused with, did show an incremental benefit at a year. In the U.S., the iStent has gone to the FDA and has been given provability, if I understand the language correctly, and even though I'm
provability
on the
sounds very political.
I'm on the panel, and I still haven't quite figured out all the nuances. But it was deemed approvable by the panel, but it still means the FDA has to decide, and it often takes a year or so for the FDA to rule on that. So that's not yet available in the U.S. Have you been using it up here, or some of your colleagues?
I've put in some. I've put in 5 pairs in patients here. Too small a number to tell just yet, but it certainly, at least in my hands, doesn't seem like something that will replace trabeculectomy by any means. It's probably about as effective as a single medication.
Another approach similar to both the trabectome and the iStent that's available in Europe, is, at least in some centers, is an erbium. I think it's an erbium YAG for doing trabeculostomy.
That's the one that Mike Berlin's
device. And basically, instead of cutting away all of the meshwork, they make 10 holes, again, to bypass that near juxtacanaliccular obstruction.
Right, and it even senses the depth it's at, so it delivers the right energy to just go through the canal.
Sounds really elegant. And I think one of the things I've heard, and I haven't seen the original data, but with the newer understanding of the outflow channels, it seems that these, in some patients anyway, the juxtacanalicular problem may not be the only problem in outflow. It may be that, particularly after a long period of time, the uphill or the downstream drains may also be a problem. So I've heard secondhand Stegman advocate doing an intraoperative diagnostic technique of canalography, or if you will, actually what you can do is just lower the pressure and see if you get blood reflux. And that actually may be a reasonable prognostic sign to determine where canal surgery of any ilk may be appropriate, whether it's canaloplasty, trabectome, iStent, or trabeculostomy. If you see the blood reflux, that suggests that the downhill part is working pretty well, and so that those may be good candidates. If you don't see that, it may be those are patients where you're better doing a more traditional outflow approach. So stay tuned. Otherwise, I think there's also been a lot of, there's historically always been a desire in terms of trying to find a blebless approach to, again, revisit cyclodialysis type issues. There was the SOLEX gold shunt that was investigated, and I haven't heard much about that.
They seem to be trying to rebrand that now. I don't know if it's a different distributor, but someone else came by my office saying, "Oh no, this is the new SOLEX,
the new and improved." I think,
You mean the thing that creates a glorified cyclodialysis cleft? That one.
And I know Bruce Shields had a device that he was working on that was a cyclodialysis, but I think my understanding is that he wasn't impressed with the long-term outcome and abandoned it. But I also know there are some venture capital groups looking at other cyclodialysis approaches. The nice thing there, and also similar to the goniotomy approaches, you can do them through a small incision, and they would presumably be blebless. But I guess all I can say about that is stay tuned.
Right. That just reminds me, going back to wanting this blebless approach, presumably also to preserve tissue if other surgeries needed. When you mentioned the iScience canalostomy and the problem with doing the surgery from above and scarring some of the tissue there, have people been doing the surgery from temporal, like we do in babies?
I've certainly advocated that. I think one of the issues that at least the folks that have a lot of experience with this, and I'm trained to do it, but again, my case mix isn't quite right that I've been able to do it in any patients. But right now, that particular procedure combines multiple potential mechanisms of action. It tightens the outflow, the native outflow with the suture.
Right, the Mary Lynch technique.
Yeah, they use the, without pulling through, but they create a scleral lake like in deep sclerectomy, and So it's a little hard, and they do the viscodilation. So it's a little hard to know which of the three is working. I've actually said that if we could do it without the scleral lake, first of all, it would make it technically a little easier because you wouldn't have to get the descemet's window.
Right.
And again, I have not seen published data, but some of our colleagues have told me that there are data that suggest that you need all three to get the pressure down. But again, if we could do it temporally or infratemporally, preserve the upper conjunctiva, just do the viscocanalostomy or the viscodilation and the tightening without the lake, I think it would be good. If you are going to end up with some potential bleb, which once you make a scleral lake, some of the patients are going to get a bleb. We all have some concern anyway about blebs inferiorly and temporally. The other issue is, frankly, summary cosmesis and short-term comfort, because eyes that if you do the procedure temporally, they have more foreign body sensation after the procedure.
Right, especially if there's going to be some sort of bleb there too.
Yeah, and the sutures from the sutures, and the eyes tend to be a little redder for intermediate term, which some patients may find problematic. And it's nice when that's tucked up under the upper eyelid. But I think glaucoma surgery is so much like a game of chess. It's always nice to know what your next move or two is going to be, and you hate to exercise a move that really makes your next move less desirable unless you know you got a guaranteed winner.
Right. Which is perhaps a trabeculectomy?
Well, at the end of the day, it's still the gold standard. I think that in pseudophakic eyes, the tube versus trabeculectomy study with at least 3-year data suggests that maybe we sold shunts, aqueous shunts short based on the really bad group of patients we'd historically done them. I was very surprised to see how low the pressures have been in the tube versus trabec study, averaging right with the trabeculectomy.
Right, because historically when we were first doing tubes, it was on end-stage eyes failed previous surgery.
And so it really shows the problem of, comparing studies, even when they may look fairly comparable.
Right.
Also, the medication requirements, by 3 years, there's not a big difference between the trabeculectomy and the tube group. So stay tuned. I understand that the 5-year results will be presented at the American Glaucoma Society. The one thing we haven't answered with the tube versus trab study is the long-term corneal issue. And I think as people develop, at least for pseudofakes, maybe better, more predictable ways of putting the tubes in through the posterior chamber, maybe that'll matter less. And certainly there are all kinds of potential opportunities making smaller tubes, maybe using OCT to guide insertion. I still, even though I've been doing tubes since about 1986, it's always a little bit of a mystery still when I put it in and I think it's right up against the iris. Where's it going to be in 6 months?
Yeah, put it in. Sometimes I'll go in a few times during the procedure. It's too close to the cornea, too close to the iris, and it's never in the same place even the next day.
Right, exactly.
Who knows? The joys of what we do. Well, I guess that's a wrap then.
Hey, Rob, great speaking with you.
Great.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks so much.
As a footnote for this episode, since the time of this recording, I have performed 3 canaloplasties and have 3 more booked for March 2011. As discussed within the episode, although technically challenging in how it combines 3 different non-bleb-forming procedures, it does have 4-year data showing greater than 30% IOP reduction and might be a valuable option before trabeculectomy for some patients. The cardiac correlate would be that canaloplasty is like angioplasty, whereas a trabeculectomy or other bleb-forming procedures are like bypass surgery. It might be worth giving angioplasty a try before proceeding with the bypass. That's our show for today. Be sure to subscribe via iTunes. Simply search glaucoma or Scherzer and you'll easily find it. Subscribe to the RSS feed or find this podcast in the iHandbook in the lectures section for download media, so you won't miss an episode. Follow me on Twitter to learn more about upcoming episodes and other news about glaucoma, electronic medical records, technology, healthcare, and education, and visit wholelotofrob.com and westcoastglaucoma.com. If you have a moment to post a review on iTunes, it would be most appreciated as well. If you're a glaucoma specialist who's attending the American Glaucoma Society annual meeting March 3rd through 6th, 2011, and have a topic you'd like to discuss for a future episode, please contact me so that we can arrange a recording session during the meeting. I produced Talking About Glaucoma without any technical or financial support, approximately once each month or so, as time permits. The AAC format is the enhanced version that includes chapter markers and show notes. The mp3 format just has the audio. If listening from your computer, on my blog, website, or iTunes, or from an iPod or iPhone, and most other portable devices, the enhanced version is the better choice, so try it first. Once again, on Twitter, I am Rob Schertzer, my blog is wholelotofrob.com, and my website, westcoastglaucoma.com. Look for me everywhere, drop me a line at podcast@iguy.org, and rate the show on iTunes. Please help detect and treat glaucoma by keeping yourself informed.